And I'll add one point on online panel. I don't think it'd be very hard for people out there with negative intentions here to co-opt panel respondents, enroll bots or whatever else, some method into these panels, and skew the results. This would not be very hard to do if you had a lot of money and a lot of resources to figure out how to co-opt online panels. I don't know how you would ever do it with our method in terms of random phone surveys. That would be really, really hard for some actor to do that.
Welcome to Political Trade Secrets, an inside look at campaigns and politics, where we pull back the curtain, look under the hood, and investigate all aspects of politics and how elections are won. Now, here's your host, Dustin Olson.
Pollster and host of the Political Trade Secrets podcast, Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
And Dustin Olson, pollster at American Pulse. They work for both Republicans and Democrats. And he hosts a podcast, Political Trade Secrets. Oh, we love that. We like that podcast.
Now, from Washington, D.C., is pollster Dustin Olson.
And welcome to Political Trade Secrets. I'm your host, Dustin Olson. Thank you to everybody for being here today. We have an interesting episode in store for you. After the last 6 months or so, where we've had historic event after historic event after historic event, there's been a real challenge for pollsters like us at American Pulse Research and Polling, and one of our other guests who also is a pollster. We're going to be talking to a couple of experts as to how do you poll through a time like this where you have assassination attempts, you have a current president drop out of the race, and then his vice president is the nominee within a matter of weeks. We watched the favorability of Kamala Harris go from being one of the least popular political figures in America to now being much more popular than she was. And what's really going on with the poll? So we're going to be talking about that, specifically about public polling. There's a difference between public polling and internal polls that campaigns spend money on to help make strategic decisions. So we're going to be exploring that and seeing actually what do reporters need to be asking themselves about the polls that they're reporting on? What do voters need to be asking themselves when they see something covered in the news? These are all very important questions for people to be asking themselves, because the polling can have an impact on what you actually think is happening in the world. So this is something that we want to pull back the hood on and see what's actually going on with public polling today. So I know I've had a lot of people asking about that, but if you'd like to get this kind of content anytime, make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe on any of the podcasting platforms that you like. You can go to Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever. Also, right now, if you're part of the behind the scenes watching this on the live stream, you can always hit subscribe or like or follow us on any of our social media, and you will get this whenever we do a live recording of these and actually be able to participate with asking questions. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in our guests. All right, so at first I want to bring in John Rogers. So John is a pollster at Torchlight Strategies. John was formerly the executive director of the National Republican Congressional Committee, where during his time there he actually created their polling department, which was an important advancement for that organization. And then once he left, became a pollster. And we really enjoy seeing what he's doing out there in the world with his polling, and is going to be an important part of this conversation. Also joining us is Lee Vasche, who's one of my colleagues at American Pulse. He's the senior pollster as well as the head of our operations. We own our own call center where we actually do our interviews ourselves, and he has a long background with statistics as well as data science. So also, I think, a degree in economics. So we're grateful to have him here. And John's a Republican. I'm a Republican myself. And Lee, I believe, is an independent, though you live in Hawaii. So you might actually be a Democrat now. So I'm not quite sure. Clarify that for us. But anyway, it's great to have you guys here. And the first thing I just want to ask you is, if you are a reporter who's getting all these different polls right now in the, where we're getting, you have Ipsos, you have ABC, you have the Washington Post, you have the New York Times, CNN. When you see a poll come across your desk, what are some questions that a reporter should be asking about the polls that they're covering?
Yeah, I think, well, thanks for having me. This is great. Let's hopefully have a lot of fun here. And my theory on why Lee is an independent is so they don't kick him off the island. But that's neither here nor there. I think that for a reporter looking at a survey, I think the first thing you need to do is look at how the survey was conducted. We'll use the term methodology quite a bit. Which, like, look at the methodology, look and see how the survey was conducted, like how was the sample gathered, how are the calls conducted, or were there calls? What we see what we see often out there with public polls is whether it be the media or a company is doing the least expensive thing that they can possibly do. And it turns out very often with polling, you get what you pay for. If you see something that is 100% what's called IVR or automated polling, or 100% online panel, that's something I would probably discount quite a bit, as opposed to something where they're doing a mix of live or text and then some online panel or some automated work. Those are generally a little bit better. The other thing you can do is look at people's track record. Like you named Ipsos. Looking back at them, I personally, it appears to me, just based on analysis, that they're taking the broken clock approach to polling, yeah. Where they just, maybe twice a year will be right. I'm not sure exactly what it is that, causes it to be a certain way, but that's generally my advice.
Very good. Well, Lee, what are your thoughts as to what a reporter should be looking at if they have a poll come across their desk as to whether it's credible, whether they should be reporting, not just it's sensational, but, that it's actually something that represents public opinion?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I would echo everything John said. And for example, in terms of how was a survey conducted and the methodology, I looked at one of these nationally released surveys last week and went to the actual file, and it was 3,500 pages. And I was trying to figure out what the methodological breakdown of the survey was. How many came from phone calls or online or text or some other method? It was not that information. I could not find it in the 3,500 pages.
They make it almost impossible, especially on state polls.
So that is a massive red flag with any survey released. If you cannot quickly figure out how they conducted the survey, I would pick up the phone if I'm a reporter and call whoever is behind it and get to the bottom of it. Because, John alluded to this, so much of the polling that's being released by news organizations, it's online panel.
Yep.
What is online panel? Online panel is people who have opted in to get paid to do surveys. They might get 25 cents, they might get $1, they might get rewards and other things, but these are all people that are like going out of their way to participate in surveys. And that is the exact opposite of true scientific polling, in that is random. And that everyone that is so we're doing a national survey of American voters. The way we approach it is every American voter has an equal probability of getting selected. Anyone could get into our sample. With an online panel, these people have purposely gone out of their way to participate in surveys. And I don't understand how any data from that source can be trusted. Now, can you use it as perhaps an aspect of your multi-mode survey to augment what other methodologies you're using? For sure. But a survey that is 100% online panel is not worth the paper it's printed on.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting. You talk about them being compensated. That's a really important point. Obviously, you have an economics background. Anything you compensate, anything you incentivize is going to have an impact across a system. That something else that's interesting. I was looking at Ipsos, and they say they're actually upfront about this on their own website. Now, when the Washington Post or ABC or whoever else who's partnering with them writes their articles, they don't mention any of this. But if you go to Ipsos, they say it, that their people on average who are part of their panel, they will do at least 7 or so surveys a month. What do you think about that? Like how does that impact also the randomization, and then also the how representative that person is?
I think it's garbage. I do not think that you could conduct genuine survey research using that sort of an approach with the same people doing your survey over and over and over again. There was an example of one last point. I think it was USC a couple of election cycles ago did a survey that was the same group of people, and they measured their differences over the election cycle. I mean, I could see some value in that.
Yeah.
But just paying someone $1 to do my 7 times, and it's just I do not believe those people are representative of the likely voters. That's really the bottom line, and that of people that are going to turn out on election day. Our approach using randomized surveys coming from the voter file is something that you can have confidence in versus people that have opted in and are getting 25 cents a survey. I don't think you can have any confidence in that.
John, you had a point you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, there's a term called panel bias, which is a well-known statistical term. Feel free to look it up if you're a nerd and want to do this in your spare time. But there's a thing called panel bias, whereas if you're on, if like, let's say one time you happen to be in a political online panel, fine. But if it's like, we're going to do this 7 times over the next month, that person now knows that they're in a panel and they're going to be asked these questions. So they're consuming everything differently than just Joe Schmo voter off the street. And so that panel bias will really develop. And I'm entirely with Lee. I believe that panel is a great ingredient in a lot of surveys, but it is not the only. Like if you tried to make chocolate chip cookies with just flour, that wouldn't be chocolate chip cookies. They'd be terrible.
Yeah.
Whereas chocolate chip cookies can be an ingredient, as an ingredient in flour, which actually this is more baking soda from size standpoint, whatever. But like, you don't just make baking soda cookies. It's like making chocolate chip cookies. It's an ingredient. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that, so it's like if you have a test at the end of the month and you know that you're going to be taking a test, you are going to, there's some accountability there. And if you're in a panel, that's basically what right. you have. Now, Ipsos and others like that, they say that they try to randomly reach out to people. So it's not just the couch potatoes, I think as Lee calls them, who decide they want to get paid to do surveys, but they actually go out there and reach out to folks. I have a hard time believing, and what you just brought up, the panel bias is a big deal. I believe about 25 years ago, around the time of the 2000 election, this was one of the issues that a lot of pollsters had at the time, that they basically had ongoing panels, and a lot of pollsters stopped doing that.
Yep.
And then it kind of creeped up. It seems to me that at least half of the national surveys right now are online panel. The other thing I find, and I'm talking about these quite a bit in the media myself, and I'm looking at them. So when you look at the national ones, you can usually figure out what the methodology is. It takes a lot of time, like Lee was talking about. But the thing I have a hard time figuring out oftentimes is Morning Consult, Bloomberg, Ipsos, others who are doing swing state surveys. Now, we all have experience with this. A national survey is one thing, or if you're doing a market research survey, it's an ingredient, like you were saying, John. It's something that you can add to your poll, do a little bit, like 15%, 20% of the whole survey is done by way of panel. But if you're trying to do Michigan off of a panel, what do you guys think about that? Like, how is that going to go? I'll go to you, Lee, first.
Well, I'd like to just think about who are your individual respondents. So if you're doing an online panel, these are people that will, where $1 is helpful to them, right? It's worth their time, or maybe it's a game, or for whatever reason, they're money motivated to do these interviews for little rewards. They're more technical in that they're signed into these apps. They're computer-oriented people. all right, that's all great. But we all know people that are not going to be money motivated by a dollar, that are not technical, that don't live on their phones and computers, right? Well, those people are also very likely voters. And you're missing this entire audience of real Americans who, aren't going to do these surveys by panel. Now, consider the respondent that gets our phone calls, right? It could be anyone of any type, any income, any race. With our research, we use live telephone survey where an actual human being is calling another human being. That's sort of the foundation of all the research work we do. And really, we believe that is the gold standard today in terms of a methodological approach. Of course, that's also the most expensive, but it yields the highest result, the highest reliability, the highest accuracy. Why is that? Because one person to another is having a conversation. And there is a bit of social pressure when a nice person on the phone smiling on the other end asks you to participate. Can you give me 5 minutes of your time, ma'am or sir? It's a really important survey. I promise you 5-6 minutes tops. That pressure gets engagement from the respondent, and that people out of kindness will say yes. And we get enough people participating that way that you're getting a wide spectrum if you're doing a political survey, of likely voters of all types, of all geographies, in the middle of the city, out in the hills, rural people that go to church, people that don't, people that have postgraduate, from Yale, people that dropped out of high school. Everyone participates in that kind of a survey. That's why it's the gold standard. And so just compare those two analogies of the person that's doing the online panel and that kind of profile versus what I'm describing with a live phone call and getting a broad base of people. It's a night and day difference. And, and that's really why I call the panel garbage, and why, what we do is so superior is for those reasons.
Yeah. John, so if you see a morning consult poll, or you see a poll that's done completely by online panel for a swing state, as opposed to a national, I'm just curious, what do you think? If it's a national poll, do you judge it one way? If it's a swing state, do you judge it another way? Is one maybe a little bit more appropriate than the other for using a panel?
Yeah, and again, I think it's a really important distinction that, I don't think any of us, I don't want to speak for you, but I don't think any of us are just trashing all panel work. I do believe that, up to 20% of your sample can be on panel, and you'd still have a perfectly scientific instrument on your hands, and it can take your costs down a little bit. What we're talking about is surveys that are conducted 100% on panel, and that's where the world's just not there today. Yeah. And I don't think it makes a difference, like swing state or otherwise. There are some rural areas that I think probably 0% panel is the right number. And there's some swing states, like maybe in Arizona, where you can get a little bit higher than that. If you were at 1/3, I wouldn't cry myself to sleep over that. If you were at 100, no way. So any of these is just, they're just cheap. And it's you're just getting cheap stuff, and you're getting what you pay for out of that, which is I personally, I'd rather these stories not get written, because then all of a sudden it's you look back at 2020 and it was the great polling tragedy, and everyone's like, all the polls are wrong. Well, no, actually not all the polls are wrong. The cheap polls that are just put out for splashy headlines or to promote somebody's company, they're wrong. Yeah. And they're, and the police force somehow has become the New York Times, which is laughable. And on a lot of these news stories that are written, they're not taking 2 minutes to call. If you're writing a news story, track me down and find me and be like, hey, can you take a look at this poll and see if this is any good? And I'll be more than happy to give you an honest take on that. Because I don't think a lot of reporters are doing that diligence, because, they're up against it on time and deadlines. And I understand that and respect it. But just another step, just calling one of your friends would, I think, go a long way for some of these stories.
I'm going to show a graph here that you're all pretty familiar with. So this is polling on October 7th. So we're recording this on October 7th, 2024, and this shows you the 2020 numbers and the 2016 numbers for the swing states. Now, actually, if it's interesting to point out nationally that is there's also discrepancy. So you look at this, you have, it's basically split. Each of these candidates has 3 states, and then one tied. But then you look at where Biden was and where Clinton was in 2016, 2020, 2016. So Arizona, for the people who are just listening, we have currently Trump today is at plus 1.4%. Back in 2020, Biden was at 3.1% and plus, and then Trump back in 2016 was 0.7%. Nevada, right now we have Harris at plus 1.1%. By the way, this is based on the Real Clear Politics average of swing state polls. In 2020, it was Biden plus 6%. And 2016 was Clinton plus 1.2%. Nevada has shown that there's less variance between the outcome and what the polling has been, worth noting, but still does have a variance. Then Wisconsin, Harris is currently today 0.8%. I don't think people realize how close that's actually being shown right now. In 2020, Biden was 5.5%, and then Clinton was 5.7%. On October 7th of those years. Michigan, Harris is 0.7%. Biden is plus 6.2% in 2020. Clinton was 6.8% in 2016. Pennsylvania right now, the average of polls is a dead even tie. Currently in 2024. 2020, Biden was plus 7.1. In 2016, Clinton 7.5. North Carolina has actually moved a little bit in recent years, I think, in my opinion. You guys can tell me what you think. But Trump is plus 0.6%. 2020, Biden was plus 1.4. Clinton was plus 2.6 in 2016. Georgia, Trump is currently plus 1.5. 2020, Biden was plus 0.3. And 2016, Trump was plus 4.7. So those are the swing states, at least as how are the folks over at Real Clear Politics. It's possible there's other states, other swing states. We just have gotten kind of caught up in those 7 swing states as being the ones. So you see that discrepancy. I'm curious what you guys think about how to look at that between 2016 and 2024. Have pollsters dealt with whatever is going on in the polling in 2016, what kind of changes have been made? Should we be expecting that we really need to be handicapping Trump's numbers right now? What are your thoughts about generally those discrepancies? With that, I'll go to you, John.
Yeah, I could do an entire TED Talk on this. I could probably take 4 hours discussing this.
All right, take 4 minutes.
Yeah, there you go. Well, for starters, I think that one of the things that we need to consider is that 2020 was 2020. It was a very special year. A lot of things broke inside of polling. There were a lot of tourists kind of just showing up, throwing surveys out with whatever numbers. Voters were home. Some were working all the time. Some were home all the time and would desperately love to talk to you for 20 minutes about their opinions on Donald J. Trump. So I think 2020, in the middle of that, you can almost mentally think of that as an outlier. As I was looking at that list, it's probably more fair to compare 16 to 24, in my opinion. But I think from there, you kind of have to go state by state, because when you look at Wisconsin in particular, I'm not sure I've ever seen an accurate public poll in the state of Wisconsin. I wouldn't trust a single thing that's put out. It's a state that's very hard to poll. There's a geographic band of states up there, like Montana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, a little bit of Michigan, where the voters, for some reason, discount the Republican number. Where they just there's a bunch of Republicans that just say undecided, and they're waiting for some compelling reason to vote for a Democrat that never shows up. And so a lot of times in those states, what the voters are showing you is the maximum amount that a Democrat will get. And what we do is we look at the margin, the difference between the Republican and Democrat candidate, and we're just zeroed in on that, where it's oh, Trump is down 0.8, but if Kamala Harris is at 46, she might only get 46.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably a little bit more accurate. Wisconsin's, is a really tough state to pull if you're a tourist and you really need to have somebody doing actual analysis.
Say more what you mean by if you're a tourist. So
Meaning, like, if you just have, like, you've never pulled the state before, you've never had anyone pay you to pull the state, you've never been on a campaign and have done this, like, gotten your hands dirty, and you're just, like, showing up and doing a survey there and throwing it out, and you're trying to balance
grab headlines.
Yeah, just grab headlines. Like, that just isn't going to work in that state. It'll work in Arizona, work in Georgia, but Wisconsin, it's just not. So, like, just generally don't trust the public polling in the state. And if you get some public polling, get somebody that's an expert and have them analyze it, because an analysis is actually really key there. And to a little bit lesser extent, Michigan. Whereas you look at these some of these other states, the public polling has been actually kind of accurate. Like you said, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina to some extent, but you've seen a few goofy things go on there on how they deal with minority sample in North Carolina. It can get a little bit goofy on them, especially based on what methodology they're going. So it's really, you got to look back at the history. Look back at the public polling there 4 years ago or 8 years ago. See if it was accurate, and that'll give you a fairly good measure of whether or not it is now. One more thing, and then I'll hand it over to Lee. I think the pollsters have gotten a lot better at balancing their samples out than they were in 2020. They're a lot better at trapping things that kind of go wrong just across the board. It's all actually gotten a lot better. And I know that a lot of criticism in 2020 and 2022, but everything's actually gotten better and a little bit more stable, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's my opinion too. By the way, for the folks who are watching on the live stream, you feel free to post a comment or question. We'll be able to see that and we'll be able to answer that here. So please do post a comment or question. And if you like what you're hearing about, you'd like to learn more about various political trade secrets, do like and subscribe on YouTube, on Apple, on Spotify, and we really do appreciate you doing that. And follow us on any of the social media. So with that, Lee, what's your explanation between the variance between 16, 20, 24, and do you think it matters?
I think John was spot on everything there. And maybe the point I was going to make that he was making at the end is, how polling has improved. One of the biggest factors in the improvement is a real focus on education. And so we see in this election, 3 presidential cycles with Trump on the ballot, that education is a huge factor for how what your voting tendency is. And so we pay very close attention to people with graduate degrees, bachelor degrees, some or no college. That number is almost as important as party affiliation. Yeah. And that wasn't really the case before 2016. But now everyone is paying very close attention to that. And so it does help. Another factor where there's been improvement is looking at what we call the 2020 recall. How did you vote in 2020? Did you vote Biden or Trump? Most people are pretty straightforward about that. They'll answer that question straight away. And you can dial in your sample to match the election outcome from 2020. So Biden won by 2 points. We just can match that up with our sample to make sure it matches reality, and that we have enough people that said presently they voted for Biden and Trump. Now you can get the right ratio. And a lot of surveys are using that, the 2020 vote shares, in terms of making sure your sample is correct. Many are not.
Yeah.
And, the Trump has really scrambled, Republican, Democrat, independent sort of party affiliation, right? I mean, the Republican Party, composition is quite different than, the Ronald Reagan Republican Party. And
we've got RFK Jr. and Nicole Shanahan and you name it, Elon Musk, who's been a lifelong Democrat. I mean,
yes, and
very different people.
And it's actually been really helpful because there's plenty of states that don't have party affiliation, and you're left wondering what the right ratio is. You're kind of having to make something up out of whole cloth. So the 2020, being able to use 2020 election and asking that in your sample has given us sort of a foundation to make sure we're getting the right ratio of Trump voters versus non-Trump. And I think that is contributing. And then the final point I'll make quickly is wow, are those numbers more favorable for Trump?
Yeah.
And I haven't seen a single news story point that out, how much better he is doing relative to 2020 and 2016. It's pretty dramatic, his polling position now versus the past.
Yeah. Well, that you brought up the one of the most important things, which is weighting, which is one of the ways we see, I think, some of the variance in the national polls as well as state polls. And John, I think you have a point on that.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could expand on something that Lee was just hitting on, and go into why these things break. So the old way of doing all of this is you got to think of it as like, what is a Republican, like whatever party, Republican, Democrat. So when you have a voter file, like there are states where people register and they're in a party, and there are states where you register and you, like Virginia, you just register. You're not in a party. We model that. So we get from a file, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a model Republican or Democrat, and a lot of the pollsters, they will call and ask pretty much a lot of people will call and ask somebody, hey, what party are you in? And party is a little bit fluid for people these days.
Yeah, it's a state of mind.
Right. And so they'll say, oh, I'm an independent, right? But they're actually a registered Republican, they're a modeled Republican. And so what's happening with a lot of these pollsters is they're taking what they've asked people, what their party is, their opinion on what their party is today, and they're weighting it to the voter file or the modeled file. And things are kind of breaking in between. That retro ballot, that recall ballot of like who'd you vote for in 2020 fixes a lot of that stuff that's broken. Because if that balances out, then it fixes a lot of that discrepancy between people's opinion on what party they are today versus how they appear on the voter file.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you guys saw the Gallup study that happened over the last few months. This is something they've been doing for decades, where they track party identification. So which party, it's a state of mind you lean towards or do you identify with. And for the first time going into the selection, it's 3 points to the advantage of Republicans. It's 48 to 45. But to your point, there's no place in the country, or very few states, I should say, definitely not any swing states, where you have 48% of the population registered as Republicans. That just doesn't happen. And I'm curious for both of you, Sean or Lee, I've heard you say this before, as far as our fielding of surveys, that you do see that the electorate does tend to seem just naturally trending a little bit more Republican in just how they respond to that party identification question.
I think lately, yes, there seems to be that the Republican mindset maybe has been have a slight plurality over a bit of a trend in the Republican direction, but that shifts quickly, and that number moves around a lot in terms of what people think. So the Trump years have really been a gift to pollsters, in that we've been able to use this recall 2020 vote and kind of figure out our sample. The next cycle, we're going to be back to, it's going to be more difficult again, because like in my state of Hawaii, that you just register, and Democrats are just people that choose to vote in the Democratic primary, which that's the only primary that matters, because Republicans don't get elected dog catcher here. And so everyone's a Democrat. So how do you begin to wait here, right? See, this is the challenge.
So you haven't clarified yet. Are you registered Democrat or are you independent?
Well, I mean, so I typically vote in the Democratic primary again, because I'm in favor of my vote actually mattering. And here, strangely, in Hawaii, Republicans are just Democrats, and everybody runs as a Democrat. And so you have more Bernie Sanders Democrats, and you have more. It's a dying breed. Who's the senator in West Virginia? You have more Democrats like that. Here, just there's no point to being a Republican. So then here, this is a total aside, but the Democratic governor and legislature just passed the biggest tax cut in the history of Hawaii, all led by Democrats. So.
Got to keep the faith, Lee. Got to keep the faith.
So I think you both have identified what might be one of the biggest factors that explains the variance between the polls nationally and also in swing states. In the last couple of days, New York Times, Siena people did. They actually revised those polls, the swing state polls, based off of doing what you're talking about, the recall 2020 vote. So before that, I wasn't aware they weren't using that. and they've been pretty competitive, showing the race pretty competitive. But by doing that, that definitely, in most cases, not every case, it improved the situation for Trump. At least one state, it actually reduced his support. But what do you make of that? That a lot of these polls that people are basing their averages on, basing their prediction models on, basing all this, are using something other than waiting on recall 2020 vote. What do you think about the credibility of those?
I mean, I think they're taking their life in their own hands, in my opinion, to some degree. I don't know that I would just like. It depends on the state. If it's a party reg state like Arizona or Pennsylvania, where there's historical accuracy, if you look back, everything's a point off or 0.8 of a point off. In those states, they're probably still fine. The places where it's tough are Georgia, North Carolina to a lesser extent, but really Michigan is the tough one to get right without a recall ballot. Or if you're in like an Iowa or a Minnesota, one of these states that don't have party registration, that's where you're playing Wisconsin, where you're playing a dangerous game if you're not using a recalled ballot. Sadly, I got to say, you got to split the states in half. If it's a state that registers by party, you're probably okay. And if not, then you're actually just taking your life in your own hands. Sienna's my alma mater, so just full disclosure.
But at some point, this 2020 recalled vote is going to be pointless, or it's going to blow up on people. Do you both think that that's possible?
Well, next we'll move into a 2024 recall vote is what we'll move into, and that I think is going to be just perfectly fine. And you'll be able to move forward. The challenge I have there is if you're looking at 2026, it's a little bit harder to do it because the electorate changes quite a bit in an off year versus a non-presidential year. But you'll still be able to look at that and use it as a little bit of a guidepost, for 4 years, in my opinion.
Interesting. Lee, what do you think?
Well, I feel like Trump's been a unique force in politics. Again, just alluding back to just how different the Republican Party is now versus 20, 30 years ago. And so if him out of the picture, I just don't know that these changes are going to stick. And maybe it will, maybe it won't, in terms of particularly we're talking about non-college, working class people that really gravitate towards Trump. Is that going to continue? Are they going to continue trending Republican? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. And so that's really what using the 2020 vote in your sample, that's really what it's getting at, is you've got people that maybe are registered Democrat or have voted in Democrat primaries and so on, but have trended over to the Republican side. And likewise, right, more moderate Republicans of the Lynn Cheney type have gravitated to Democrats. And things have gotten scrambled. Trump is sort of at the center of that. With him out of the picture, are we going to go back to the more historical trends or not? We're going to find out. One other point on looking at this cycle versus last, and last time I was on your show, we talked about the hidden Trump vote and how he consistently has underpolled in most states 1% to 2%. Sometimes less, sometimes more. And so considering that Trump has underpolled and looking at his position today relative to the last, particularly 16, I would got to think his campaign is feeling pretty bullish, given where they're at. There's a lot of time to go here, but plenty of votes are underway, and every day more voting is occurring.
So do you think that the media, which they like the horse race, they get things ginned up? I'm on various television programs with Jim McLaughlin, who's one of the pollsters for Trump. I think sometimes he kind of is beating his head against the wall because the media narrative is that Trump's not polling as well as he could. But I think from their perspective to what you're saying is that he's actually maybe polling better than he ever has. I'm curious what you both think about that. We just talked about the discrepancies in swing state polling over 24 to 2016. Nationally, it's Harris is ahead by 2.1, and I believe Clinton was ahead by like 4.7 or so, and Biden was ahead by close to 7 at this point in their respective years. So what's your thoughts about that? Do you think this is maybe his best polling that he has had?
It'll sure be better than 2020 because it was all, everything was all goofy back then. Just in life, but in polling too, it turned out. But yeah, I would imagine it's not by some landslide, but he's probably polling slightly better than he was. He's certainly polling better than he was in 2020 because most of his polls were just wrong. And so, yeah, he's polling better than the polls that were wrong in 2020 that had him losing states by 8 points that he ended up winning by 1. But, compared to 16 that, he snuck up on people then too. So I would have to imagine that his numbers would be better.
Yeah, you think it's more like 2016?
Yeah, but he's probably in a better ballot position on the horse race than he was same time in 2016 is my guess. Because to your point, I think there were a lot of that shy Trump voter, or reticent Trump voter, whatever you want to label it as. I think there were some people out there that just didn't want to get screamed at, that they just weren't saying that they were with him, and that are now just the border's a mess. I can't afford to feed my family. I'm with this guy because things are a disaster right now.
Yeah.
And so I think people are a little bit more prone to, people that support him are much more prone to being honest about, being forthcoming about that.
Lee, what are your thoughts?
Okay, we're trying to predict the future, so that's not easy to do. And is there going to be a shy, hidden Trump vote? We're going to find out. But there has been the last 2 election cycles. And so my wager is there will be as much as in the past. I don't know. But if there is even just a 3/4 of a point hidden Trump vote out there, and you take these polls today, if they're accurate, he's going to win an electoral college landslide because he'll win every battleground state. Now, I do think the hurricanes in North Carolina and Georgia, this hit counties that he really ran up the score in both of those states. And it's a terrible disaster that's occurred out there where bridges are just gone and people can't even get to other polling places. So we haven't necessarily encountered a major disaster in 2 swing states right before the election. And that, as we're sitting here, another one is bearing down on Florida, which anyway, that is just a whole other X factor here, where if you look at Georgia and all of the elections that have taken place in that state the last 4-6 years, right, all the different Senate elections and so on, these have all been by 1 point or less differences. So close. And so any factor, one way or another, even the slightest breeze, whether it's in favor of Harris or in favor of Trump, could alter the outcome in a state that's on the razor's edge.
So that's a good point, and we have a question from a viewer right now, and feel free, wherever you're watching, to post a comment. But this kind of goes to what you were saying. How are you handling polling around major changes in the election, like assassination attempts, Biden dropping out, indictments, etc.? I would add to the etc. disasters, like the ones in North Carolina and Georgia. So how do you do that? Clearly, assassination attempts is different, and Biden dropping out is different than disasters. I mean, those all have different impacts. I'll just answer on the assassination attempts or any historic event happening. If you're in the middle of a survey, it really impacts, first half of the survey was fielded before the historic event. That can have an impact. Clearly, anybody who was in the field the weekend that Biden dropped out, you had a different candidate on the top line of that poll, and that really kind of blew that up and wasted your money. So that's one thing. But I'm curious what you guys think about how do you actually poll North Carolina and poll Georgia right now, knowing that there's counties that don't have any communications whatsoever.
I would say that it does. I think cell service has been restored, so we reach most people by cell phone. But if your house is gone and you're in a school gymnasium, or you're taking a call from a pollster, I don't know the numbers of likely voters that are in this situation. It's kind of I haven't been able to find like population estimates for how many people have been impacted, but it's wide swaths, and it just when the numbers are so close between these candidates, just any factor can have a humongous impact. On the other questions, I think we've seen a lot of change, but then pretty much everything is still the same at the end of the day. And certainly the biggest factor was Democrats were, there was a tremendous enthusiasm gap between when Biden was the nominee and now Harris is the nominee. Democrats became locked with enthusiasm, matching Republicans and maybe even exceeding Republican enthusiasm. So it was a night and day difference, but our surveys are capturing that now. So I think all of those factors, a good multimodal survey with quality methodology accounts for these changes. And what we just hope is that it doesn't happen right in the middle of your survey. Yeah. Because then you're kind of screwed. Yeah. So
you have to put an asterisk on your survey and saying this was fielded partially before and after.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then in an emergency scenario, you could do what's called case weighting. Like, let's say if you absolutely had to be in the field in North Carolina the day after the hurricane, and you had 12 counties that were, didn't have power or cell service or phone service, and you your client is freaking out. They're like, no, we need to go anyway. And you look at the call center and you just have no one from there. In that instance, you could asterisk your survey and do what's called case weighting. We're like, okay, we're going to take the crosstabs from the last survey and apply it here for these 12 counties, which Trump won. It's like 80% counties.
Yeah.
And just say like, okay, we're going to case weight this geographic area for this one, throw an asterisk on this. And then you're just looking at the crosstabs for the rest of the state is essentially what you're doing. Like you're treating it like the rest of the state is accurate, and this one is like the best we can do in this emergency. But that's like a rare case. Like you wouldn't do that if you didn't absolutely have to. That's like you're gonna have some bad luck going on if you're in that circumstance. Or it's like this happens day one after you started fielding, and then you have a conversation with your client about like, okay, do you want to pull up, wait a week and go back in? Most of the time they're like, no, just forge ahead.
Yeah.
And then you just like have to discuss the options. In that case, you might want to consider case weighting.
Well, in some ways, hopefully this is not going to be the case, but if you have a hard time getting people in those counties, that is somewhat telling you, if the situation's not remedied, is telling you what turnout could actually be like.
Sure. But in this case, we were a month out from the election. So, there's time to restore coverage. There's time for, to get aid in there. If we were a week out, then then it would be like, okay, here's what this looks like, but you're trying to be, you're trying to paint a picture of what, of what we got going on here. And that would be how you would handle it in that extreme circumstance.
Yeah, that would be pretty bad. And it tells us what the situation could be in the future if we were to have that happen right next to the election. Well, just one last. I have two last questions. I know that both of you have spent some time thinking about low propensity voters, and how do you actually go about getting those people into the sample? And to explain what that is to folks, these are people who don't show up very often, and some people even call some of them no propensity voters, so someone who's never shown up, but they have a tendency to be maybe one way or the other. So what are your thoughts about low propensity voters right now, their possible impact on the election, and could they be the key factor as to who actually wins? I'll go to you, John, first.
You got a lot of questions, a couple of questions in there. I'll take the last question first, which is, key factor, early returns of absentee ballots in Pennsylvania. And absentee in Pennsylvania is actually a fairly low slice of the pie. It's only about 15 to 20% of the electorate. We are already starting to see some 0-4 voters, some of those no propensity voters voting. I think as of Friday, there were like 300 or so statewide, but that's a massive number in a state that could be really close. Mm-hmm. And so we are actually starting to see some of those folks turn out. How do we get them and who are they? I think that my theory going into this cycle was that these people have long since moved away and they just, they're live in North Carolina now, instead of Pennsylvania. But, we've recently disproven that where these these no propensity voters are actually just sitting there waiting for a reason to go vote, essentially. And so from a polling standpoint, I think some people in a cycle like this might try and, might not put any of them in their sample. They might, when they pull the file that they want to call off of, might not include any of them on there. And what's called inactive voters, which are a little bit different. It's not that they don't show up; it's they don't show up to the point where the Secretary of State has labeled as labeled them as if they don't turn out in this presidential, they're going to get removed the file. So a lot of times they don't have any inactives in their survey. And I think in an election like this, we're already starting to see some of those people vote. And so some of these low propensity voters might be missing from some surveys. How do you get them? Same way as everybody else, except you got to hit them a little bit more is, I think, is the key to victory there. Whereas they're no propensity for a reason, that they're just kind of they're low information voters. They're not sitting around watching the news 24/7. They are harder to get. And you got to try because there are going to be some of them turn out this year.
I'm glad that you mentioned Pennsylvania. So Lee and I have a survey in the field right now in Pennsylvania. And Lee, I'd like your thoughts because I know this is something you put a lot of thought into, as well as about getting to the low propensity or no propensity voters and some specific things that we might be doing to get a little bit deeper and hopefully get to some of those folks.
Sure. So, John touched on this in terms of who are these people and have they moved? And there are all kinds of explanations for who these people are because the voter records say that they don't vote often, but there is, first of all, this is the government and these are elections offices, and so the government makes lots of mistakes constantly. So, I think that plenty of people they get married, they might move across town or change counties. And they lose their voting history attached to their record. And so they may have had a perfect voting record, but they just moved across town or often across county lines, a lot of registrations by county, and it gets lost, separated, their voting history. That's a part of it. Another is motor voter laws. A lot of people are being forcibly registered to vote against their will. They have no interest in voting, never will, never have, but the state registered them without their consent. So you've seen a huge increase in a lot of states that have motor voter of zero voters. I say 0 or 4, they voted 0 out of the last 4 general elections. Lots and lots of zeros are now on the rolls who didn't register and have no interest in voting. Now, some of them may turn out and the campaigns are marketing to them, but I live with one of these voters, my beautiful wife. There's no campaign postcard or commercial is going to change her perspective on voting. She just isn't interested. She may or may not. It is a crapshoot. And I'm talking about this presidential election. I don't know if I can twist her arm enough to get her to vote. Some people just don't care and they opt out. Now, how do we get them in our surveys? I have always felt that if you answer our phone and do our survey, that is an indication of likelihood to vote. Yeah. And so what we call is our frame in terms of who is our random sample of people that we're calling. So how do we set up our frame in terms of the random voters who we are going to call and harass to participate in our survey? So what we do is we cast as wide a net as possible and that the frame is really, really wide. And we make sure that we are calling voters that have a terrible voting history, the same amounts of calls going to those voters as the voters that vote every single time. And now we don't get very many of these lower propensity, lower information voters participating. That's a natural reflection of the reality that they're not going to vote. And in Russia and other countries, they get 100% turnout. Well, we know that we know how that is happening. It's not real because unless there is some, a gun, or risk of imprisonment, people are not going to vote who don't care about elections. And in our country, it's optional to vote. So, but it costs more money, of course, to include these low propensity people. You have to make lots and lots of calls to try to reach them. And it's more expensive and time consuming. But we put a lot of effort into trying to find those people and include them. And so, in our sample, we almost always include a breakout of of the people that have voted 4 out of the 4 elections down to 0 of 4. And we also put a lot of emphasis on making sure new voters, people that have recently registered in whatever jurisdiction we're calling, that we include them in our frame so they have a chance to get a call from us and to participate. So the bottom line is, I believe you need to cast as wide a net as possible and give everyone an equal chance to participate in your survey. And just by the way that things fall out naturally, you're going to capture those low propensities who are going to vote.
And then something I think you also do is we make sure in the actual fielding of it, we have multiple passes at that same universe within the frame, so that you give them as many different options as possible. Plus the multimodal, so everyone here is doing multimodal where it's live and text, sometimes live text and IVR. Sometimes we add in the online panel, so it's 4 live text, IVR, which is RoboDial, which I probably should have defined early on, and then the online panel also, and that gives you like the best possibility of reaching people if you can hit them multiple different ways. One last question, and this is just for the voters who are watching right now, people who are consumers of media, and they see it's maybe completely different headlines one day to the next as to what polling is saying. What can they be to be good consumers of polling and media that talks about polling? I'll go to you, John, first.
Yeah, I mean, I would take it all with a grain of salt. Especially on the public polling, if you see some, I think a lot of people, it's confirmation bias where they're just, they gravitate toward the stories that, look good to them. Just make sure you're consuming all of it where, even if it's a story that looks unfavorable to your candidate, still give that a read. Look in, if you can find it, to Lee's point, if you can't figure out how that survey was conducted easily in there, you can probably mentally discount that.
Yeah.
If you want to do one more step of research, you can go back into 2020 or 2016 and look at that same pollster and see how they, or that same outlet like NBC News, Wall Street Journal, like look and see what they looked like 4 years ago or 8 years ago, or even in 2 years ago. You could just take that one little step and just like check it and see if they had done that race before. And then also you can Google the same race in the same spot and just see if this is an outlier, versus everything else that you're seeing out there, and just, and you got to accept that maybe it's right. That's also possible as you see those, unless it's Pollster that is historically wrong.
Yeah. But even in that case, that person maybe fixed what they were doing, and they might
have. Yeah, that happens. Absolutely. But to me, it's easy to spot because some of these folks don't change anything cycle over cycle, even though, there's one out there that I think was the worst pollster in 2020 that I'm not going to name. And if you look at their polls today, they have changed nothing. It's all exactly the same methodology, and there's the exact same amount of stories written out there about it. Even though people spent all of 2021 crying about polling, the same people are still writing stories on the least accurate polling in 2020 and 22. They're still writing stories on it.
Yep. It's an insatiable hunger that the media has for polling numbers. It really does amaze me, but it's also what gets me on television. So
there you go.
So Lee, what are your thoughts as to what you would tell a discerning voter as to how to consume media that has polling in it?
Well, I wish most of all that these aggregators, different sites that combine all the surveys together, that they would put some on that original table you see when you go and look at the results, like the method that the survey was conducted.
Yep.
And then I wish that they would separate out the online panel only surveys. Like they have an average of the true multimodal surveys that involve some phone component, and then they have the online panel only. Because if you look at the averages of those two, they're going to be quite different.
Totally different.
You're absolutely right.
And so that would be my one plea, is that the 538 and the Real Clear, and there's plenty of others, that they would include methodology in their averages, because then people can make a way more informed conclusion about really what's going on here. Because I'll always say that a single poll by itself, it has statistical variance, and we just have no way of knowing that it's absolutely precise. We think it's within this range, right, which we call margin of error, but we don't. But it could be anywhere in that margin of error, and even then, we think that's only 95 times out of 100. It could be within this range. 5 times out of 100, it could be out. Anyway, that's the underlying statistics of polling. There's just variance. So the average kind of tries to solve for that.
Yep.
And in that the trend, now you're looking at the trend, not just an individual specific poll and their number. If these aggregators would separate out, it would be a huge service to the public.
Or not include them.
Or not include them.
And I'll add one final point on online panel. I don't think it'd be very hard for people out there with negative intentions here to co-opt panel respondents, enroll bots or whatever else, some method into these panels,
yep,
and skew the results. This would not be very hard to do if you had a lot of money and a lot of resources to figure out how to co-opt online panels. I don't know how you would ever do it with our method in terms of random phone surveys.
Yeah,
that would be really, really hard,
yeah,
for some actor to do that.
If it hasn't happened before, everything under the sun. I think there's somebody got hacked over the weekend, some big important organization. Everybody gets hacked these days, and to hack a online panel would not be hard. If it's never happened,
I am not a conspiracy-oriented person, but if you wanted to influence public thinking, if you were you wanted to influence the election, this would be one heck of a good strategy.
Well, you could do it legally. Yeah.
What's that, John?
No, nothing. You wouldn't even have to hack it. Like, you wouldn't even need to do anything illegal in order to do it.
It's really about the respondents and having them show up and lie about who they are. Who knows? I mean, when it's for all the marbles and it's the most powerful country in the world, and it would be easy to do. Who knows what people would do. Well, thank you both for being here and for giving your thoughts on this topic. It's something that is big with the media, big with voters. Everybody's asking, I'm sure you guys all the time, what do you think? What's going to happen? And this gives people a little bit of insight into how to read the polls. So thank you very much. I appreciate you both being here, and on with the show. So thank you to our guests for being here today, John Rogers and Lee Vasche, and for their expertise in polling. We really do appreciate them taking the time to illuminate what's going on in this 2024 election when it comes to polling and the variances in the public polls. We talked about aggregators. We talked about weighting. We talked about all sorts of fun statistics, though I do think a lot of people do ask us about it, so hopefully you got something out of it. If you like this kind of content, if you like learning about political trade secrets, how the sausage is actually made, to pull back the curtain and look under the hood, please do subscribe and follow on places like YouTube, Rumble, on Apple, on Spotify. And if you want to get the behind the scenes with the live stream, please do follow us on any of the social media, and that will be delivered to you when we go live with these kinds of interviews. But with that, thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for your support, and have a great day.
Join us next time by subscribing on iTunes, and get show notes and sign up for our newsletter at politicaltradesecrets.com.